And I think that, look, I get the desire to want to innovate. I get the desire to want to push the boundaries with new technology. But you have to understand, the second that you deviate from tried and true ways of doing things, you have to be doubly rigorous. And they clearly were not. So I think it's a lesson about psychology, very much so, and leadership.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. If you add it all up, all of those references to wanting to be Captain Kirk, wanting to be the SpaceX of the ocean, wanting to be like Musk, wanting his craft to be the iPhone of submersibles, what it all comes down to is wanting to be. And in order to be those things, he has to prove himself. But he can't do it alone. He can't stand surety for his own credibility, which is why he needs P.H. Nargile and Boeing and NASA, and why he visits billionaires in person and tries to sell them tickets directly.
I know what you're thinking, and you're right.
You might say a guy trying to prove himself isn't rocket science. Lots of people feel they need to prove themselves. I mean, I feel like I need to prove myself and my worth, although a lot less than in my 50s than I did in my 40s. But in terms of our argument, you might say it's not really telling us anything about what's driving Stockton Rush. Well, actually it is. Because in his own words, he wanted to become something, failed, and so in this last season of his life, he tries again. He tries again to become something. And in his mind, he succeeds, sort of. Because he does innovate, sort of. He does build a craft that, come hell or high water, does get him to the Titanic. Once, twice, a few times. Unsafely perhaps, but it gets him there. That is an achievement of some kind. But is that enough? And
but would you be able to rest?
No, is not able to rest because, like I said, he never became an astronaut in the Captain Kirk sense of the word. Going down to Titanic was just one step in that process. He's still in the process of becoming. So he's not able to rest. He hasn't completed his mission. And I mean, with him at the center, what he wants is to be himself at the center of his own self-made universe. As the legendary captain of a ship called
Enterprise.
And make no mistake, Enterprise, being enterprising, is also part of what's going on here. That's also part of the prize, the reward Stockton Rush is seeking.
These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise.
Because remember, in his hiatus from the dream to become an astronaut, he becomes instead an entrepreneur, a venture capitalist, a businessman. And so when he emerges, still wanting to be an astronaut, this time of the ocean, well, he also wants to be an enterprising astronaut. This venture is his. It's his passion. It's his project. It's his passion project. And that makes it a lot more personal and emotional and hard to become emotionally detached from. So him proving himself isn't just taking a craft in the shape of a turd to one of the world's darkest, deepest, and gloomiest underwater graveyards. He's got to do it again and again, cheaply, effectively. And what is that other thing? Oh yes, safely.
But I wasn't worried about the engineering. I certainly wasn't worried about imploding because we had tested everything. That's how it should be.
Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, apologies for not putting this episode up last night. As you're about to see, the analysis ended up going a lot deeper and a lot further than I anticipated. Maybe I had a Jerry Maguire moment. Maybe it was bad pizza. But anyway, apologies for that. Well, you are watching it now. If you're enjoying this episode, if you think it's worthwhile, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. So this concept of Stockton Rush having to prove himself, which we touched on in the previous analysis about Stockton Rush, is something that he probably thought he'd already demonstrated, he had already proved, right? He had gotten down there effectively, cheaply as well. Safely, maybe not so much, but he'd proved all of that right in the beginning. And so as far as he was concerned, he probably felt, I've done it. I proved it. But it's the economics of it that start to engage driving forces and issues of scale and scope that I think begin to suck him in. Things like sunk costs and an almost Ponzi scheme of tickets sold but not yet redeemed. And to make this fraught scenario even more fraught, more fierce, COVID strikes at the beating heart of the venture, making what is already uncertain increasingly desperate. It's threatening to derail the whole venture, and it's threatening to take all the momentum that is developed out of the project. As complicated as things are becoming, if only it were that simple, if only it was just that, well, the odds would have still been stacked plenty against them. And when the time came in those lonely, haunted, sleepless hours counting down to the next dive from Saturday the 17th to early Sunday morning the 18th, well, he might have cancelled again if the odds were just what they were, what I've just mentioned here. It's not like he never did that before. It's not like he'd never cancelled a dive. But for the last dive, he had top-tier folks on board, none of them more of a marquee player than the billionaire Hamish Harding. To fail to prove himself in front of him would be hard, but possible, if something else wasn't a factor: competition. Harding wasn't just an adventurer, he'd come from a rival outfit. Was Rush really going to throw in the towel with him on board? Surely Harding's own success formula wasn't that different from his own, and surely it made the difference between the doubters and the Captain Kirks of this world. It wasn't just about going, it was about boldly going, and so that is what he decided he needed to do on that final dive. Suck it up, be bold, and just do it. This competitive thing with Triton wasn't just a guy from Seattle being dogmatic and proud. It had come a long way. It had been inculcated, this spirit of competition, ever since those years at Princeton University. And it also went beyond Princeton. There was also family prestige to uphold. Imagine the pressure of having to perform not just to yourself, to your clients, and to your peers, but to some ghostly apparition, some phantasm of historical figures, some ghostly version of his former self, this 18 or 19-year-old who'd been the youngest pilot, commercial pilot in the world. You've got to meet that standard as a 40-something, a 50-something. In Star Wars, the Force ghosts appear whenever there's a happy ending, but the reality is the family ghosts are always watching, often disapprovingly. And before OceanGate, Stockton Rush had already fallen short not only of his own potential and his own vaunted ideas, but probably his efforts in San Francisco must have seemed ordinary compared to his namesakes. So there was also this added pressure to make history. Imagine if somebody asked you that, just said, look, what I need you to do in your life is to make history. And so what do? Loud noises were always there. Cracks, bangs, so what? The crackling was something to expect. What was he supposed to do? Walk away and start over again? That would be the opposite of proving himself. It would be disproving himself again.
A team of civilians soaring into space as paying passengers could be on hold tonight after the deadly crash of a Virgin Galactic space plane over the California desert today.
The explosion of that Virgin Galactic rocket plane 4 days ago over the California desert. While the co-pilot was killed, the pilot was able to get out and survive.
And now I want to change tack. I want to go to a moment, a day in 2014, when Stockton Rush was standing in the Mojave Desert during that infamous, that fatal flight of Virgin Galactic. And remember what we're trying to ascertain here, what was driving the CEO, not just one thing, kind of the full dimension of it. And so the question now becomes, how did Virgin Galactic influence Titan's CEO? And I think this is a critical dimension to Stockton's identity. Besides the Captain Kirk ideal, which is almost a separate thing, was this Damascus experience in the Mojave Desert. The founder of Virgin, Richard Branson, was there, and somehow in that moment, Stockton Rush changed his trajectory from space to the deep ocean. According to the New York Post, quote, watching Branson showboat on the wing of the grounded spacecraft, this is not the one that crashed down, this was before it crashed, Rush was turned off by the idea of sanitized space tourism, end quote. I'm not sure if that's the real reason that he was turned off. I think at the start of that day, he wanted to be a passenger on Branson's rocket. But then watching it crash and burn and fall out of the sky into the dust of the desert while he was there in 2014, that couldn't have been very inspiring. And if there was anything sanitized about this, I think it's the fact that Stockton Rush was there. He saw a fellow entrepreneur ship destroyed and the pilot die in the name of innovative space tourism. I mean, I think that's why Rush had a change of trajectory. Of course, you can't really admit that in your presentation that's about courage and exploration, even though perhaps you should. And it may also be that Stockton thought of the deep sea not only as cheaper than going out into space, but ironically easier and safer as well. This does raise the question, did Stockton Rush ultimately go to space?
And half our mission specialist clients who go to the Titanic have either been to space or are going to space.
Where we are now in mid-23, many people have already gone into space. And clearly he could have, Stockton Rush could have, and apparently at one point he wanted to be the first in line. So did he go into space at the end of the day? I suspect he did not, and this may be the reason for it. But I suspect there's another part as well. If he was turned off by a craft on fire falling out of the sky, I suspect he was turned on by Branson's superficial charm. And perhaps Rush recognized the Branson in himself that day in the Mojave. Perhaps there was also a sense that he didn't want to be a bit player in someone else's version of Star Trek. So when he says he wants to be Captain Kirk, I think the epiphany in the Mojave was, I want to be the Richard Branson of my thing. Now, before we move on and move away from the whole Virgin Galactic thing, let's pause on it for a moment and just observe a couple of additional insights. And I think if Rush had done this, if Rush had a better attention span, perhaps better self-discipline, and even James Cameron makes an allusion to that he didn't have perhaps the right amount of rigor and discipline, whoever was in charge of Titan. If there was a bit more awareness in a particular area, then things could have been prevented. But certainly if his awareness of Virgin Galactic had been better, he may have learned something simply by watching Branson's attempt to get his show on the road. Because Richard Branson also sold a lot of tickets and then struggled to deliver. His craft took almost 20 years to reach the point of taking tourists into space since Virgin Galactic was founded in 2004. In fact, less than 2 weeks after the Titan sub implosion, Virgin Galactic finally managed to pull off its own first successful commercial spaceflight. That was 9 years after Rush himself had stood in the desert watching. We also know that as early as 2020, Rush knew the results of tests conducted at the Deep Ocean Test Facility in Annapolis, Maryland, and he knew that the Titan's hull then showed signs of cyclic fatigue. He knew that. Also that the hull's depth rating was or ought to have been reduced to 3,000 meters. He knew then that the carbon fiber configuration was, in his own words, not enough to get to the Titanic. So if he knew and if he'd experienced a setback like Virgin Galactic, what did he do wrong? Why was he unable to avoid making a mistake? Well, if you consider that Virgin Galactic, as I said earlier, spent 9 years going back to the drawing board, perfecting, improving, certifying, and making their concept safe, well, Rush was back at it just the following year. OceanGate have scrubbed their social media presence, but this is a screen grab from July 11, 2021 from Instagram, where they say, OceanGate Expeditions proudly announced that Stockton Rush co-pilot Scott Griffith and mission specialist P.H. Nargile made history by completing the first dive to Titanic in a 5-person submersible. And I mean, 1 year earlier, they were talking about cyclic fatigue, and it was only rated to 3,000 meters. So how rigorous was the testing between 2020 and 2021? So can you see it's difficult not to compare the two operations, Virgin Galactic and OceanGate, and that is why so many people did, especially at the time of the implosion. Like OceanGate, Virgin Galactic was also struggling for more than a decade to achieve profitability, and currently Virgin Galactic has a backlog of 800 customers. Just 8 months ago, on October 7, 2022, 60-year-old Stockton Rush made a presentation at the GeekWire Summit where he described himself using the past tense as a space person. So to reiterate, he wanted to go to space, which was a childhood dream, and then he decided to go on specifically Virgin Galactic, but then something happened. He spoke of wanting to be the first man on Mars and being a modern-day Captain Kirk, but then something happened. As early as 2007, Stockton Rush seemed to accept that he wasn't going to Mars, but I don't think it's for the reasons he was giving, namely that what his reason was that there's no economic reason to venture to the Red Planet. Well, are there sound economic reasons for visiting the Titanic or climbing Mount Everest? And that brings us to the next section, age and envy. I think it's because he was in his mid-40s and he realized he was simply too old and going to be way too old by the time manned missions to Mars were happening. I mean, by the time Richard Branson went into space aboard his own spacecraft, he, Branson, was 70 years old. He was the third oldest person to fly into space ever, and it had taken his company almost 20 years to do it. And I'm sure that Stockton Rush saw that and didn't want to be on that kind of track. One is the impression the men who went down on Mission 5 were all fairly old lions. I've said this before. And a single lion cub was with them on board, and it was Father's Day. And I think there was a small Lion King thing going on, and pride was at stake. Call it what you like, pride, ego, hubris. But part of that trifecta, wanting to prove yourself. Think about the lion in the Lion King. He's also got to prove himself in order to become king. Besides pride and ego, Stockton Rush was a contemporary of other innovators who recently achieved near hero status. They'd done it. And so if he was standing still while the likes of Victor Vescovo and James Cameron were achieving legend status in the ocean, well, then he's actually moving backwards. And again, far from proving himself, he's doing the opposite. And so all of this analysis, all of this feeling our way through the psychology, where does it bring us? Well, it brings us to the kernel. It brings us to the psychological kryptonite, this green stuff that was Stockton Rush's weakness, fatal flaw. You know, if the fatal flaw of the submersible was the carbon fiber hull, well, now we're going to deal with Stockton Rush's fatal psychological flaw. You can see it taking shape. The thing that's driving him, not just to prove himself, but to be a successful enterprise, is also settling a sort of score with the past where he'd fallen short of his own aspirations in some way. That's why on this go-round, he must push harder, press on, dig deeper. In effect, the thing that's really driving him is a ghost. It's a ghost version of himself that's stronger, faster, better. That ghost is a kind of glittering Captain Kirk version of himself, unassailable but also, alas, unattainable. I've seen the psychological kryptonite play out in real life. When I wrote about the Everest disaster, a couple of books on it, 3-4 books on the Everest disaster, you saw one team with some pretty old, pretty tired men on it, older than 50 years old, trying to prove they were still masters of the universe. And what happens? They go to Everest to prove they are heroes, only to prove or discover they aren't. And when things go wrong, well, who do they blame? Do they blame themselves? Or do they blame the weather and their leaders? Some end up writing self-justifying books in order to still serve this insatiable hero appetite. With Stockton Rush, he too sees himself as a big deal, and he is. His wife and her family are also fairly big deals, and so are his great-great-grandparents. So do you see, it's not just about a fella that's driven, or a fella who went to Princeton, who feels he has to compete with his contemporaries, although it's that as well. The point of it all is that he's trying to be impressive to himself and to an audience on the greatest stage. I mean, you see him giving presentations everywhere, showing off his colors like a peacock. But underlying all the pageantry, all the posturing to make sales is failure. The failure that came before and the failure that he's struggling so hard to conceal and transcend.
He had come such a long way, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. But he did not know that it was already behind him.
Like a climber on Everest that's too slow to summit, not only does he fail, he realizes he's failing, and yet he still can't face it. And yet the summit is right there. All he has to do is keep going. All Stockton has to do is do one more dive. The reality with Titan, as with Everest, is beyond a certain point in reality, every step forward is a step backwards. The finish line on Everest isn't the summit, it's the halfway point. But some expend all their energy to reach their goal, because that's usually how goals work. And in the normal world, boldness is often rewarded, but not in extreme places and extreme situations. For Stockton, his Everest summit was the carbon fiber hull that he refused to give up on, because he'd come so far, and like Gatsby on the pier, he stretched out his arms towards the dark water in a curious way, and far as I was from him, I could have sworn he was trembling. Involuntarily, I glanced seaward and distinguished nothing except a single green light, minute and far away, that might have been at the end of a dock. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. And that's obviously a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Like Gatsby, Stockton believed in the green light and the orgastic future it represented, a future of potential and promise, of things that had yet to be denied. As old age creeps on us, that denial of life does too, which is why the point is getting into the Titan, which is a kind of pupa. Do you understand? The anathema of the man and what is driving him is to not get into it. It's his ship of dreams. It's the vessel that makes him Captain Kirk. The point is to not deny oneself against all odds. I mean, the odds, beyond the odds of the submersible, are already bearing down on us. Entropy is gaining a foothold. I've thought about this same problem more often myself, haven't you, as I move away from 50 years of age. 60 right now is an almost terrifying prospect. Am I to be an old man so soon, and with so much still to do, so much still left undone? The thing that is our undoing is this ghost fairy tale we have of ourselves, competing with that. And so I think I've thought about this, the way to untangle ourselves out of this dangerous spiral is to let go of the ghost and simply say, how can I prove some simple thing about myself? Some simple way from who I am today and who I was yesterday. Simple, achievable improvements day by day, not immeasurable efforts against our own force ghosts, spread across the unconquerable abyss of one's own life. Sure, we can burn matches as we reshape ourselves as young men and women, but beyond a certain point, the summit is simply too far, and we must turn away and live or die trying. Do we want a life that is all trying and no fulfillment, no enjoying the fruits of our efforts? Instead, endlessly trying, endlessly reaching out to the green light, and that green light endlessly being out of reach. There are other lights too, like the light of a warm flickering fire in the winter, or the light of the midsummer sun swimming in a child's eyes. There's also the light of sunrise and sunset, and the light within. It doesn't need to be achieved or attained or to put a flag on and waved. It only has to be felt within, a flickering fire that won't last forever. But while it flickers, we don't have to burn. All we have to do beyond a certain point is feel it, perfect in itself and of itself, and to follow our bliss. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.